Hey everyone, welcome back. So this video is on a Black Templar painting I did, and we're going to start with some concept work I did. Just starting off with helmet designs, trying to figure out the look of the character. So as you all know, a pretty big Warhammer 40k fan, but I haven't really done that many pieces for that universe yet, just because I wanted to keep my portfolio sort of open. I didn't want to kind of pigeonhole myself into just doing 40k art, but I figured a couple pieces won't hurt. So anyway, what I'm doing now is I'm just trying to figure out the look of the helmet, and anyone who is familiar with the universe knows there are many variations of the classic Space Marine helmet, and since I'm sort of a little bit more hardcore than most people, I can probably name off most of them. So what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of really quickly in Photoshop manipulating a single piece of line art and just adding in new lines and details to make variations of the same piece. It's quick, it's kind of dirty, but it gets the point across. It's just concepting. And essentially we're taking the original, I believe it's MK8 or MK7 helmet, which is the one above, and right now I'm working on as well. And we're just kind of doing variations, moving the box grill around. And it's very simple. I'm just using a brush. I essentially paint one half in. I use the lasso tool to get some straight lines, and then I'll duplicate one half of the helmet and just flip it horizontally. So this is a Heresy pattern helmet, which is actually probably my favorite, but it looks kind of Stormtrooper-like, but I didn't end up using it for this piece. Just a cool idea, though. Now I'm doing some coloring. So what I'm doing is I'm just using a normal layer, just painting in with 100% opacity, as you can see above. And what I do is I take the line art and I put it on either a darken or a multiply layer. That way it's going to stay as line art. Any corrections I might have done in white or whatever aren't going to show. Now what I'm doing is I took all the color layers, I merged them, and then I made them all the exact same tone, and I removed all the color. And that provides a nice background for shading. So I'm taking kind of like a neutral gray, and with the brush tool at around 50–40% opacity, I'm just shading it in. Very simple, just using a multiply layer just to darken. And now I'm going back with a normal layer, and using a lighter gray, I'm painting in the highlights. And you'll see I'm using the eyedropper tool. So what I like to do is I'll just kind of sample, and then I'll paint a little bit further, and that way I get a nice smooth transition. So I'll sample, or I'll put a nice strong highlight, right? And maybe like at 100% opacity. Then I'll sample it, and with like a 30% opacity brush, I'll paint a ring around it. And then I'll sample where they overlap, and I'll do another ring between them, and subdivide until the highlights become smooth and you can't tell that they're separate layers or separate brush strokes. Now I'm just going in with a darken layer and adding some further shading just to kind of bump the contrast. Space Marine helmets are actually kind of funny. So you can hold the miniature and look at the geometry, but they're kind of difficult to actually paint because when things are painted or things are made on a miniature scale, they aren't lit the same way that they are if they're a true scale. Which is actually why people paint miniatures to begin with, to make the lighting look more realistic for the size. So it's actually kind of difficult to determine where light would fall on a Space Marine helmet, where it actually, its true size, which is probably be about a foot by a foot. Alright, so I'm just using color dodge layers. I'm using warm highlights. Now I'm creating a multiply layer using cool highlights. And I'm doing a color dodge with a cool highlights here. This is for the bounce highlight coming from below. And I'm going back and adding some detail highlights. Okay, so now onto the fun part. Now that I have my base helmet, I can make variations of it pretty quickly. I'm just using a normal layer here, and I'm adding kind of the Black Templar Iron Cross to the faceplate. Black Templar are kind of the religious fanatics of the Space Marine chapters, so they love kind of putting giant crosses on their faces, and they do little litanies of battle on their helmets, which you can see. And now I'm using just normal layers. I'm painting in a little golden skull emblem. And for better, to make it more visually appealing, I've added a light brown background. What I'm doing now is I'm taking an overlay layer to add the glow of the, I guess, eyes. They're not really eyes, they're kind of like ocular sensors, but you get the idea. Now I'm adding a metal cross to the forehead here, and watch what I'm doing. So I figure out the lighting first, and then I add some kind of intense highlights because this is supposed to be kind of like a polished chrome look. So all the upward facing planes have a warm highlight, and all the downward facing planes have a cool highlight to represent the bounce highlight. And then I add a little bit of shadow with a multiply layer. And a little bit of glow around it of representing the light bouncing off the metal surface onto the helmet around it. For the last variant of the helmet, I'm doing a kind of a veteran style modified helmet with an ocular piece. So this is pretty simple. It's just a normal layer and then highlights with color dodge, shadows with multiply layers. Same thing, warm highlights, cool shadows, and then cool bounce light. The best way to think about chrome or highly polished metal is it's a little bit like a mirror. So every area on it is going to be reflecting its environment. So if it's facing the sun or a warm highlight or a warm light source, it'll be bright and warm, and the areas that aren't facing that way will have whatever else is around. Normally it'd be cool in comparison to the sun, or if you have a warm highlight. And as you can see here, I have this sort of like bright green LED on the side, which is casting a small reflection. The last part here is just me labeling the helmets, just so I can kind of keep them all straight. Alright, now to the fun part. So we're doing the figure sketches here, and I've been reading Andrew Loomis's Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, and he has some really great instructions on how to paint your basic skeleton or frame. So as you can see, my techniques changed a little bit. The only downside of this is that I become a lot more dependent on line art, which I actually don't like to do just because it means a lot of work later painting in details. So I'm just figuring out different poses, different possible poses for this piece. And if you've seen the photo or the finished painting already, you know which one I've gone with, which was number 4. Now, Space Marines, I got a couple comments about this, saying that this guy has a really tiny head, and yes, he does. Proportionally to his body, his head is rather small. The reason for that is that Space Marines are, according to the story, they're 10 heads or 9 plus, pretty much. They're supposed to be 8 feet tall, so their heads are smaller proportionately to their bodies because their long bones have been extended through genetic manipulation. So what we're doing now is I'm just going in using just a normal brush, black with 40% opacity. I think it's like a 10-point brush, and I'm just figuring out the outline for this guy. And after doing some review, I realized the head should be flipped the other way. So it's contraposto, which is contraposed or turned away from the line of action. The reason you do that is it makes the composition and the figure more interesting if the lines are sort of not all facing the same direction. And this is the detailing part. I'm just going in, looking at my reference, which I'll provide later in the video, and pretty much tooling out the details here. It's actually taken me years to figure out how a Space Marine's armor would work. There are a lot of pieces, and the way the miniatures and a lot of the artwork depicts them, they actually wouldn't be able to move very much. And if you've read any of the books or you've read any of the stories in the books, in the rule books, that is, or if you ever just sat down and thought about it, be really hard to be combat active if you couldn't move. So they should be a little bit more maneuverable. And the way you do that is lift the pauldrons off the shoulders a little bit so that they can, reach up and touch their heads, or reach over their heads if they needed to. Alright, so we're still doing detailing. And there's a lot of different armor parts. I used some MK3 armor, kind of just like some early builds of the armor. I want this guy to look like a veteran. So he doesn't have all new armor. He's got a kind of a mishmash of replaced parts. Alright, so we're adding a tabard and detailing the feet, adding some rivets. Scaling up the head a little bit. And adding more details. He's got a chest plate, sort of in the tradition of Teutonic knights who wore chest plates like that. And refining some of the lines, adding some details to the pauldron. And here's the fun part. So I tried adding the heresy face or helmet, and it looked cool, but it didn't really fit, so I didn't keep it. Now we're trying out even more details, so I'm adding these little skulls to the rim of the shoulder pad. And now we're adding this large Black Templar chapter symbol, which is the Iron Cross. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold or allergies or something. And he's got these little miniature shields on him, which represent different crusades or different campaigns he's fought in. So there was a while here, you'll see, where I'm fooling around with different helmet types. It took a while to figure out where I really wanted to go with it. He kept looking like a Optimus Prime, or I don't even know what. It just didn't look right. So he went through a lot of different iterations of design. I tried adding some laurels, a little skull emblem, which became an Iron Cross in the end. It's kind of funny. You can see which designs I was going through from my original concept sheet. And as you can tell, he's very much the Crusader look about him. The Black Templars, they call their military campaigns crusades, so they're pretty much the most zealotous, single-minded Space Marine chapter out there. And I'm just adding more details, more rivets, little kind of niches, nooks, service studs. He has a power sword, which is comparable to, I guess, like a lightsaber. It's a sword that can kind of cut through almost anything. It's an energized blade. And it's pretty big in this case. Superhuman with motorized power suit, power armor, carrying a gigantic sword. And of course, it's got more skull emblems, as always. So I'm still trying to figure out this helmet. And I think this is finally where it starts taking shape. Part of the goal of this project was I wanted it to look really grim dark, which is sort of the key adjective when describing Black Templar or 40k in general. Is they're very grim. It's grim dark, which is sort of this depressing, grimy, low-tech and high-tech world of, it's very dangerous. There's lots of death. Death is always present. I mean, in the Imperium of Man, which is the main human force in the game, they worship the Emperor, who's this entombed corpse, pretty much. So, as you can imagine, there's a little bit of a fascination with death in this universe. So I wanted that look to come across. So I've added this, very characterful kind of gothic lantern on chains. He's got the Imperial Aquila on his chest. He's got skull motifs, the Iron Cross all over him. And this is really the fun part here, is where I add this sort of metal halo that you could find sort of on statues, religious statues in Christianity. They have these sometimes. And I had these little flying buttresses to the side of it. I think the reference I used for this was like St. Peter or Paul or someone. And there it is. It's got kind of like a little reliquary in it with some precious stones, and looks very fancy. Alright, so now I'm refining some of the curvature of the armor. As you can see, I'm adding these kind of sketch lines to make sure that everything looks straight and in perspective. And I'm detailing the exhausts on the power plant backpack. So little details here and here to make here and there to make sure the perspective looks right. And this is all just using a normal brush, normal layer, 50% opacity. And adding some, I would say piping, but that's not really the right term, but sort of decorative elements to the edges of the armor. And when in doubt, add another iron cross with the skull, because that's what Black Templars like to show off. So that's what we're doing. Now you might say to yourself, this guy kind of looks a little bit villainous, and what's interesting about the 40k universe is that the Imperium of Man, which are kind of the protagonists, are not really the most cut and dry good people you could imagine. I mean, they're xenophobic, they're pretty zealotous. They're they constantly go on these religious crusades. They sacrifice thousands all the time. So good guy is sort of an arbitrary term in the Warhammer 40k universe, which I kind of like. I don't really like it when there's the shining white knight and the monster all the time. I like it when it's a little bit more gray about what's really good. So what we're adding now is a sort of this little zealoty, I guess the right term would be a servitor, but in 40k they don't use robots. They use servitors, which are kind of these people who have become machine-like in the sense that they have lots of implants. They usually have their minds scrubbed, so they have no emotions or memories of their own. They can run kind of programs. They're kind of like robot zombies a little bit. So I thought it'd be neat if this guy had a little servant to carry his shield for him, because he's too busy being cool to carry his own shield. And as you can tell from this guy's proportions, he is in proportion. He's 7 heads tall, so he's dwarfed by this giant space marine. And we have this very nice, large Baroque shield with the Imperial Aquila across the top, which I've now become very good at doing quickly, as you can tell. And it has a large iron cross across the front. Because when you're proud of your chapter, you like to show it off, I guess. Now you'll see I use sketch lines. That's just to make sure that everything stays proportionate, in this case symmetrical, because I'm working on mechanical details, which are usually straight. And I usually paint out the inside. So if I'm painting over an area, I'll just use the eyedropper, grab whatever's nearby, and paint out the inside to make sure that I don't have conflicting line art. Now I'm adding some purity seals, which are sort of these religious oaths that are recorded on long pieces of parchment and affixed with wax seals to armor. And this guy looks pretty crazy. I mean, he's got his mouth open, he's screaming. I added like a kind of like a slave collar at one point. And I tried adding these pipes going into his kind of neck or head from the rest of his torso. They looked really cool, but I wasn't really loving the way he looked. So I ended up redoing the face to be a little bit more, or the head to be a little more humble. Traditionally, in artwork featuring Black Templars, they have all these little initiate guys following them around, these little acolytes, and they always have their heads down. and some nondescript pipes running under their hoods. So I figured it'd be cool to keep that tradition going, so that's what we did. Now I'm trying to figure out how they're going to overlay. I don't want him to be completely blocked out by the Templar, but I want it to be clear that the Templar is standing in front of him. We're adding sort of kind of rosary beads with little fetishes on them. Fetishes in the religious sense. These little decorative elements. More purity seals. And adding some details to the acolyte guy. Here I added some more kind of rosary beads to his armor. And I had decided it'd be cool to have a sensor, and sensor, C-E-N-S-E-R, they're sort of these, they always look different, but they're essentially these little things that hold incense. And in this case, it's a hollowed out skull with a plate on top that releases sacred incense. Alright, now we're on to shading. So I figured I wanted a cool light source, and I decided that since I was using a cool light source, I had to use warm shadows. So I'm using a multiply layer with like a 40% brush. I'm using a pink, which is strange because we're going to have a pink space marine in a second. But it's just, it's a nice warm color for shadows. And he's not going to look pink in the end, don't worry. Though I'm sure some of my viewers would love that. But sorry, not going to happen. Alright, so more shading, lots of shading here. What I usually do is I'll sort of paint everything in with this shaded color, and then I'll kind of pick it apart. I'll erase out parts, and then I'll darken other parts, just to build up contrast. So gotta make sure that the light source is consistent. Consistent lighting is super key to having any composition or any piece look right. If you've ever seen photo manipulation, you can always tell when it's a shoddy photo manipulation job because the light source won't be consistent. Especially when people paste people's faces over other things, you can tell it's been pasted because in everything else in the photo, the lighting is coming off left, and then on that one face that's been pasted in, the lighting's coming from the right. Alright, so now we're shading the acolyte and the shield. He's in shadow, and he also isn't wearing reflective, kind of painted metal armor, so he has a little bit less contrast going on, kind of more grubby looking. And I decided to paint in the shadow to help establish the light source and make him look more grounded in the piece. And before I did that, you can see now I'm trying to pinpoint exactly where the light source would be coming from. So originally, as you can see here, the light source is coming from sort of the viewer's perspective down and left onto the marine. So the shadows are trailing off up and to the right. Alright, now we're adding extreme highlights using I guess they're not really extreme highlights, they're just normal highlights with a color dodge layer. And we're using a blue color, a dark blue actually, and it still comes out looking almost white because we're using color dodge. And since we use the warm shadows, we're using a cool highlight. Now, part of the big problem I had with this piece was I wasn't sure what scale of an illustration I wanted when I started out. Originally, I was thinking sort of just kind of the illustration you might see in like a campaign or a rule book for a game where it's blocks of text with a character sort of just on a white background shoved in there to break up the text. And that's fine, but as I kept working, I realized I wanted to have a more expansive piece, and that's where it became difficult. Mostly because I hadn't really anticipated that in my original composition and lighting. So I was sort of stuck with what I already had, and it became difficult to make the composition and background I wanted later. So next time I really need to figure out what sort of scope I'm going for. Okay, so now that the lighting is done, we're doing the coloring. As you can tell, this is just a normal layer. Actually, that's not true. I take it back. What it is, it's a normal layer within a group, which is a multiply layer. That way, this is a little trick I sometimes use. The reason I put normal layers within a multiply group is because the layers within the group will stack upon each other, whereas they'll block each other out essentially, which is what you want when you color. But if you were to make them all separate groups with multiply layers, there would be some transparency and you get some funky stuff going on, which doesn't look right. So what I do instead is I just use a bunch of normal layers within a group, and then those sort of block each other out and overlap each other, and the final composition of color is enacted as a multiply property above onto everything below it. And that's the best way I found of doing it when you're coloring line art. So for everyone asked how I color, that is one technique I use, especially when I'm doing line art. A lot of the other time, if I'm doing like a tonal piece and I decide to color it, I'll use color layers, or I'll use, pretty much color layers. Color layers have the same effect as nested multiply layers, but the reason that I wanted to use nested multiply layers here is that I don't really have a strong enough contrast and tones to warrant color layers. Color layers are they're really only useful if you've got something going on already. Like if you've kind of got your piece towards it's sort of refined, you're just sort of throwing colors in. That's when color layers are really useful. For kind of blocking stuff out, they're not as useful. Alright, so I'm painting the tabard now, and you'll notice I'm not actually painting with color. What I'm doing is I threw down a gradient and I put a mask over that. And in the mask, I'm painting the tabard in. So I'm using a white brush on the tabard's mask so that it shows up, and then I erase it using a black brush. And now we're just doing other details. We just finished the acolyte's robes. We're doing the chains and the lanterns now. Oh, I guess I forgot part of the robe. I had to go back. And you can see in the sidebar my layers. I usually name my layers. If I'm painting on one layer, I don't because there's no point. But when I have a very complex array of colors and layers of then nested groups, it makes sense to label them so I can find them if I need to. So what I'm doing now is I have the Black Templar codex from the Warhammer 40k miniatures game. So I went in the book, I looked up the painting section, and I checked out all the different crusade badges, and I figured this guy's going to be a real badass, and he's going to be a veteran of dozens of campaigns or crusades. So I found a bunch of different crusade logos, and I painted them onto various parts of his armor to show that he's been on all these different crusades. He's pretty much seen the galaxy. He's an established member of the Black Templars chapter. It's not sort of just a new initiate, straight out of training. He's a little bit more hardcore than that, which would warrant the fact that he's got such sweet armor and all these awesome relics on him. Newbies don't really get all that cool stuff yet. So this is a really kind of sneaky way to do checkering, which I just did, which was I used essentially I painted a big stripe down, and then I used a mask to cut out chunks, and then I inverted the mask to do the rest of the opposite checkers. It's quick, it's dirty, but it works. So what I'm doing now is I'm bumping up the contrast and brightness. I found that things were just looking really ill-defined because the contrast and the shading wasn't high enough. Okay, so now I'm adding details. I've got little pieces of scripture written on the armor. It's in black ink when it's on a white surface, and it's in white ink when it's on a black surface. And I'm running some stitches through the tabard to make it look like it's sewn, kind of a woven pattern. And here we go, adding lines of little text to the purity seals. Purity seals are not just pieces of empty paper. They're long oaths that the Marines take before entering battle. Alright, so I decided it was time to go back in and add more highlights. So I'm using a color dodge layer with a cool light blue highlight color. And I'm just going in and trying to figure out where the light would hit, adding kind of more pinpricks rather than general light blocks. So surfaces facing the light source are obviously going to be more lit, whereas faces which are not facing the light source are not. Pretty straightforward, makes sense. It can get complex on flat planes actually. If a flat plane is facing nearly directly at the light source, it's pretty much all just highlighted, and I don't know why I have a problem with that. It just makes it look like it's not really detailed, but sometimes I just have to deal with that. The case which I'm talking about are kind of the little amulets around his ankle there. The one on the side is almost directly facing the light source, so it should pretty much just be a straight up highlight, but I didn't want to lose all the little details I put in there. So we're doing more highlights on the shield. And one of the reasons I hate using line art is that it makes everything look kind of pillowy. What I mean by pillowy is it's kind of like got this hard dark color around the edge and it's highlighted inside, and it just doesn't look right. It doesn't look real. So that's why I really hate using outlines. So I'm establishing the vanishing point and the perspective of the piece, and I tried to add clouds to sort of hint at where the vanishing point was on the horizon. And I think I did an okay job, but I didn't love it in the end, so I got rid of it. And what I'm doing now is like I said, I hadn't planned this piece out really, so I'm sort of fumbling along trying to figure out what I want to be my backdrop. And at first I thought, we'll do some mountains and we'll keep everything in perspective. It's gonna look cool. A lot of people were surprised. They thought I was gonna do like a ruined city scene. And the reason I didn't do that is because the last piece I did was sort of an interior mechanical scene, and I didn't really want to do that again. I wanted to branch out a little bit. What I'm doing now is I'm adding kind of like halos of light coming from the perspective point to represent how details are removed by aerial perspective the further away you get from the viewer. And I'm trying to paint in more clouds here. I'm not really an environment artist. I do a lot of backgrounds and occasionally I do environments, but I'm way more comfortable doing concept art, so I struggled a little bit here. And of course, when you're feeling lazy, just crop it in like I just did. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm adding some aerial perspective to the Space Marine. And what I'm doing is I'm just selecting the area around him and painting kind of the details out of the further pieces. So his arm, which is actually behind his hip, is a little bit lighter and less defined than the other arm and the rest of the body, which is in front of him. Alright, we're doing a color dodge layer representing sort of the bounce light and the light from the eyes. So you can see that the underside of objects are now highlighted by the bounce light. And what I mean by bounce light is that normally if you have a very strong light source, light will bounce off the ground and back up at you. And that's what bounce light is. It's very simple. And bounce light is usually the color of the ground, unless you have an extremely colored light source. So in this case it's brown earth, so it's a brown warm bounce light. Alright, so I'm trying to refine the shadow as well as smooth out the shadows on the rest of the piece. They were kind of just chunked in originally, they weren't that smooth. And I'm painting an interaction shadow. So what that means is that the shadow from the Marine is falling across his little guy. And that can be really hard to figure out. Shadows are kind of complex because The closer you are to the object, the more true the shadow is. The further away the shadow gets from the object, which is casting the shadow, the more distorted they get. So, I mean, if you can play with the flashlight and figure out yourself, but essentially, the further away something is, the less defined the shadow becomes. It becomes more diffuse. And also distorted just from the light. And now I'm going in and I'm adding some stronger stronger shadows with a multiply layer, because I really want to remove the line art. And line art is useful because it's great for detailing, but the problem is that if you try to remove it, you suddenly have this blob of shadow and highlights and color, because a lot of my details are just locked in with the outlines. So what I'm doing is I'm going in with the multiply layer and painting in detail shadows to counteract the loss of the outline. Now I'm using a color dodge layer. I'm providing a secondary light source, which is the lantern. And it's casting a smaller area of highlight. It's not as powerful as the main light source, obviously, because the sun is pretty strong. But it's casting kind of like a smaller halo of light around itself. Just, it shows up on some of the smaller, closer things, and it's not really that strong, but on really reflective objects you can see it, but on more dull ones you can't. And I had to show somehow that the lantern was actually further back than the arm. The arm is the furthest object forward. So what I did was I just threw down a lighten layer, copied whatever the color was of the lantern's glow, threw down a gradient, and then using a mask painted out the areas that I wanted to be highlighted. So this is a pretty time-consuming part coming up right now, which is I'm going in and I'm painting out all of the edge highlights, which is integrating the compositional foreground with the background. And as you can see, this takes a while. I mean, there's a lot of line art, and it took a while to do. And I'm just using a normal layer and the eyedropper tool for this. I'm just going in, painting out the highlights, sampling what's nearby, trying to get everything to look like it's not sketched out with a strong line art piece. Now I'm adding some localized highlights from the lantern onto the bottom of his arm and the chain. Gotta be careful, because remember the arm is further out than the chain, so it's actually more of a rim light than a true highlight. And here I'm fixing the highlights on the skull and the hand. So hands are tough to highlight. They're really difficult to light because hands are really complex objects, and it's difficult to highlight complex objects. It just is. There's no two ways about it. It takes a lot of practice, and you'll see as this video goes on that at one point I actually just paint out the hand and start fresh because it just wasn't working out. What I'm doing now is I'm continuing my normal layer. I'm painting out highlights painting out outlines, painting in highlights and shadows, as well as smoothing out the highlights. So you can see that I'm sort of painting out those kind of scratchy marks that I did earlier, making everything a little bit more smooth. And this is part of the reason this piece took so long to do. I tend to over-render my work, meaning I go in and I lovingly detail everything. I'm trying not to do it as much, but old habits die hard. Alright, so I'm adding more kind of block highlights and shadows. And this forearm gave me no end of problems. The problem was I drew it originally correctly in proportion and perspective, but as I painted and shaded, that sort of got distorted a little bit. Because remember, lighting actually helps determine form. So if your lighting is incorrect, your line art can be great, but it won't look right. Alright, so I'm refining these shadows, smoothing out the highlights still. Adding some more reflections from the lantern onto the armor. Warm light source, as you can tell. This is a color dodge layer I'm using now. And now I'm back to the normal layer. Just smoothing out the highlights on the boot. And adding the lantern highlight. Alright, so this was an interesting part. So I had this kind of rosary, and I didn't like the way it was looking, so sadly it's not going to stick around. What I'm doing really quickly right now before it changes is I'm adding, well, it changed, but I was adding local shadows. So the parchment is not laying flat across the armor, so it will cast a shadow. And it really makes the piece look more realistic if you have items on a character casting shadows onto other parts of the character. Like I said before, I didn't like the rosary, so I'm painting it out. And unfortunately, we now have this floating skull, so that's going to have to get fixed. I'm just doing some detailing on this little reliquary item, making it look like polished gold. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the pen tool, and I just stroked it using a custom brush of chain link. And it's a really good base. It's nice and consistent. It didn't take a lot of time. All I have to do is go in and highlight it and shade it, and voila, I have a piece of chain. And now I'm painting the shadow in. And done. Let's fix that part. Of course, now I have to go back and do everything else. So what I'm doing now is I'm just shading the tabard in to make sure that it looks like it's properly lit and shaded. Before I got really serious about digital painting, I used to do a lot of 3D modeling and lighting. So some of the terminology I use sounds a little bit more like what a CG artist would say, and that's probably why. I like to think of terms in kind of how I would do it if I was modeling it in 3D. Though I know I don't really do 3D modeling anymore. I don't really have the same passion for that as I did for painting. Alright, so I'm desperately trying to fix the highlights on this arm, as you can tell. It doesn't look right. I even moved the fist around, I tried distorting it, but I think it doesn't look right. The hand looks like he's tilting his hand forward too far. So for the next little bit, I'm going to try to fix it, but in the end, I'm sorry for everyone who loves this hand, but it's not going to stick around. Right there, what I did is I did a little quick paint over just to make sure I wasn't going crazy, and then he actually was in proportion anatomically, and he was, but it just still didn't look right. So to help break up this form, I decided to emblazon it, and what I did is I just kind of painted these 3 swords on really quickly using a normal layer, and just sort of sampled the area around to get the highlights from the rest of the armor to make sure everything looked the same. And now I'm using a multiply to add shading, and it's done. Alright, so this is where I gave up on the hand. I decided to paint it out, and he's now an amputee. And I try repainting the hand a couple times. Nope, I gave up. I said, you know what? I'll come back to it later. I'm going to work on the background a little bit. I do that sometimes. I'll get really frustrated with one part of a piece, and I'll say, you know what? It'll get done, but I'm just not going to do it right now. I'm not thinking clearly enough. I need to kind of cool off, think about it, let it incubate, and then I'll come back. So what I'm doing now is I'm painting in kind of like a canyon wall in perspective. And it looks pretty neat. I didn't love it though, so it does end up getting changed. Pretty much it was this little arch in the midground that I didn't really like. It was a cool idea at first, but it didn't really help the perspective. It made it kind of confusing. It's also a pretty strange natural feature to have occurred, so. So what I'm doing is I'm just using darken layers here. If you've seen my Death Cult Assassin tutorial, you know how I do this. What I'll do is I'll select areas, paint them in perspective, and then I'll erase out parts, or use another layer and just sort of sample the area around it and paint out parts. If you can't tell yet, I like to paint stuff out. I should probably be one of those people who remasters digital film and composites 3D models into live action because I'm really good at painting things out. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I'm trying to tie the different levels of the canyon together by sort of these branching gradients. The only problem is I wasn't really keeping them on perspective very well, as you can tell, so I had to go back in and fix them a little bit. And I had some more perspective lines so I could get more tiers going on. So doing these little ridges, it looks kind of weird. It looks sort of like a canyon of different, you know, strata of deposits, but I didn't like it, so I sort of removed it and instead made it this big carved out kind of canyon wall. Not sure what I'm doing right now. Oh, I guess I'm back. Sometimes I mess up when I'm recording and I'll hit pause, or I think I hit pause and I don't, and it's actually the opposite, so I'll be recording myself doing nothing and I'll be not recording when I should be, but that doesn't happen very often. Okay, so what I decided was that the background canyon didn't look cool enough, so I decided to make it this giant kind of arch. And what I'm doing now, you'll see there's two perspectives, there's two vanishing points, and the reason I'm doing that is so I can have a 2-point perspective. Okay, now I'm back to drawing the hand. And I looked at my own hand, I moved it around, I tried to figure out how it would look if it was in this pose, and I saw that it'd be more, you'd see the knuckles and the phalanges, which is the first part of the hand, more than the back of the hand. So that's what I'm trying to paint in. Now, the hand looks great. The only problem is that it doesn't really match the highlight scheme of the rest of the figure. So later, actually just now, I went in with some color and hue layers, and I tried to get it to match the rest of the painting, because if it might look great, but it doesn't really match, then it doesn't work. It needs to be convincing that it's the same person's hand. Okay, so I decided to add some details. I think I was watching some movie and they showed Rio, and I thought it'd be cool if we had this giant sort of monk or space marine statue. It eventually became an angel. The Imperium loves its angels, so there's this giant carved stone angel figure in the background of this piece, which is kind of cool. I quickly tried to texture the ground, didn't really work, so that didn't stick. What I'm doing now is doing more highlights, localized shadows, painting out some of the lines still. Trying to get these little thingies on his forearm to look cool. And I didn't know what to do with the background. I kind of just wanted to be done, so I painted in some streaks of drop pods, and I was going to finish them, but I didn't love them, so I didn't really finish them. What I'm doing now is adding smoke from the sensor, kind of this fragrant purple-pink mist, and it is behind the lantern chain, so it has to be, I had to erase the parts out where the lantern chain would be present. Okay, when in doubt, add dust and smoke. If you don't feel like painting something, dust and smoke it up. And what I'm doing now is I'm using a mask layer to paint out the areas where the dust and smoke would not be covering. Now, what's really cool about dust and smoke is that it adds pretty much just crap. It adds junk into the air, and that sort of particulate matter makes really interesting stuff to work with when it comes to lighting and detailing. Really quickly, what I'm doing now is I'm texturing him using some beat up old metal surface textures. The way I'm doing that is I use a soft light layer, throw it over the whole thing, and then using a mask, I paint in the areas that I want to have the texture applied to them. What's coming up is really unfortunate. So this piece took 23 hours, and really quickly I just used the warp tool to apply a cloth texture to tabard, and I'm going to be doing it to the acolyte in a second. What really was unfortunate is that the recording process messed up about out of the 23 hours, the last 3 hours were corrupted. So what's going to happen in a minute while I'm doing all this texturing is I'm going to go into Photoshop, and then layer by layer I'm going to activate them so you can see what I was doing. I don't have the actual recordings. I'm very sorry about that. Believe me, my heart was broken. So you won't be able to see my actual brush strokes, but you can see what I'm doing part by part. And I apologize for that profusely. I'm so sorry that happened. Believe me, if I could have stopped it in any way, I could have. I tried for hours to recover the footage, to export the AVI from the camera recording file, but nothing worked. So I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen again, but sometimes these things happen. So for the background, I decided I wanted to paint in some more Marines so he wasn't just by himself with this dude. And that's what I'm doing. And so this is actually shot in real time. The reason I did that is I wanted to have a little bit more time to explain what I was doing. So what I did was I kind of really quickly, just using normal layers, painted in these quick space Marines. Sometimes I use darken layers, but it's kind of arbitrary. What I did there is I added lightning to the sword using color dodge layers, color dodge overlay, and a couple normal layers. I have some custom brushes I use as well as just normal round brush. And I believe that's a soft light layer. It just adds sort of like kind of glowing, vibrating look to the sword because they're supposed to be able to vibrate between atoms or molecules, and that's how they cut through things. And now I'm showing you the different flags and Crusader emblems as well as the other acolytes accompanying the guys. And they were done the same way, just darken layers and or normal layers. The lantern was done with a normal layer, and then I used a little color dodge layer for the glow. Just use some, these are mostly just darken and normal layers. The highlights are done in normal layers usually for this part. Everything else is done with a darken layer. And the little Space Marine pinprick red eyes are done using color dodges. And I'm painting in just kind of like a crusade crowd behind them. So as it goes away into the distance, they get smaller, and it gives a real sense of scale to the piece. I mean, there are a lot of Marines. That's usually how crusades happen with the Black Templars. They kind of throw everything they have. So what I did now is, you can see I'm painting in sky. I didn't want the sky to just be this brown mess, so I painted in some clouds, or lack thereof clouds, negative space to show where the clouds were. And what piece is really complete without some lighting from a cathedral? I wanted something in the foreground to balance the composition out, so I got some photos of ink or smoke, and I used them as darken layers to add this kind of creepy mist that's receding away from the bright light of the crusade. And I just painted in some more smoke and stuff with multiply layers. Those little sparks I added are my custom brush that I love to use, the shrapnel brush. There's color dodge or normal. That was just, I think, a lighten layer of some green to help balance all the warm colors. And we're adding some more tendrils using, that's actually the same brush I use for hair, believe it or not. And this is the last part coming up. So what I like to do is sometimes I'll have like a couple repetitive layers, and I just use them for tweaking more than anything else. I'll take all my layers, I'll flatten the image, I'll duplicate them, and then what I'll do is I'll kind of I'll throw a render of some kind on. So it'll either be sometimes I use like paint daubs, and I'll make that layer type as lighten. And the reason I do that is that paint daubs they add little nice, interesting random details. So I'll take an image, I'll duplicate the layer, I'll apply a paint daubs render to it, and then I'll set the layer type as lighten, and I'll lower the opacity. It's usually around maybe 25%. I don't want it to be too strong because it can make things look pixelated, which is no good. And the other types I use are posterization, because sometimes it can boost up the contrast a little bit. I'll set that as a darken layer type, and that's usually around like 10 or 15% opacity. And then the last type I use sometimes, not all the time, is cutout. Cutout's interesting. It can make things look really graphical, so sometimes I use it, but I generally don't, and if I do, it's not at a very strong opacity. It's probably like 5%. That last layer was a adjustment layer, just to increase the exposure of the image, make it look a little more blown out, because I actually kind of like that look sometimes. So once again, you should be seeing the image now, as well as some of my original reference stuff. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate you watching. I've made some great comments, a lot of good feedback. I really appreciate all the people coming, looking at the videos, subscribing to my channel. It's really great. If you like what you see, please do like the video, please do subscribe, and feel free to share it with your friends. If you get a kick out of it, maybe they will too. I plan on doing another piece soon, probably another Warhammer 40k themed one. My goal is going to be to have a little bit more of a dynamic setup in terms of composition. I kind of want to force the camera to be a little bit more crazy looking, a little bit less balanced. So that should be fun. If you have any questions or critiques, please let me know. Leave a comment. I read all of your comments, I promise, and I reply to as many as I possibly can, which is usually all of them. So once again, thanks for coming by, and hopefully I'll be talking to you soon.